They said the Alpha King feared nothing. Sarah was the only one who knew the truth. For as long as she could remember, she had hidden something far more dangerous than secrets. She had hidden her fantasies about him. In the Stonewolf Dominion, power was law. Alphas ruled packs, kings ruled alphas. And Omegas like Sarah were expected to soften the sharp edges of that brutal world without ever daring to shape it. The mate bond was sacred, but forbidden for royalty. The council claimed desire made rulers reckless, that love made them weak. Alpha King Paul had ruled for 12 years without a mate. Long enough that the court whispered he was broken. Long enough that rival packs tested his borders like wolves circling wounded prey. Sarah served as a royal archivist, cataloguing the bloodlines and treaties that kept the Dominion from tearing itself apart. Safe, invisible, trusted with secrets but never seen as one herself. Perfect for an Omega who had learned early that wanting the wrong thing could get you punished or claimed. No one suspected what she imagined in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. No one knew her fantasies ran deeper than submission, darker than surrender. She didn't dream of being commanded. She dreamed of being chosen, of watching that legendary control finally, willingly break for her. But on the night Paul returned to the castle, with blood soaking through cracked armor, his silver eyes shadowed with something she'd never seen before, Sarah realized something terrifying. Her fantasy was about to become real, and she had no idea if either of them would survive it. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now back to the story. The first thing Sarah noticed was the silence. For years, that silence had been her refuge. The archive halls stretched empty after dark, lit only by oil lamps that cast wavering shadows across ancient stone. She preferred the night shift. No courtiers whispering about Omega placement. No visiting alphas whose gazes lingered too long. Just her, the dusty records, and the peculiar peace of a world that had forgotten she existed. Tonight, that silence felt different. Wrong. She was reshelving a collection of border treaties when the air shifted. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure change that made her wolf stir beneath her skin. The creature had been dormant for so long, Sarah had almost forgotten what her awareness felt like. Now she lifted her head, nostrils flaring. Danger. Blood. Sarah's hands stilled on the leather-bound volume. She inhaled slowly, sorting through the scents that drifted down from the upper levels. Stone and parchment, lamp oil and dust. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, iron. Fresh blood. The alarm bells hadn't rung. No guards had rushed past. Whatever had happened, the castle didn't know yet. She should have left it alone. Should have continued her work, pretended she'd noticed nothing. That's what a smart Omega would do. The kind who understood that curiosity could get you killed, or worse, noticed. Instead, she followed the scent. The lower archive corridors twisted like a maze, narrow passages carved from the mountain itself. Sarah moved through them by memory more than sight, her soft leather shoes silent on stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The blood scent grew stronger. Her pulse quickened. She rounded a corner and stopped. Alpha King Paul leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, where blood seeped dark between his fingers. His armor hung in cracked pieces, revealing tears in the leather beneath. His breathing came shallow and controlled. Too controlled. Even wounded, even alone, he held himself like a drawn blade. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah watched his pupils dilate, watched him process her presence with that unsettling focus that made him so dangerous. Paul noticed everything: hesitations, breathing changes, the tiny betrayals the body made before the mind could catch up. He was noticing her now. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough with pain. "I work here," she replied, somehow keeping her voice steady. "The upper archives." His silver gaze never left her face. Not the abandoned corridors where kings come to bleed in private. He was giving her an out, a chance to pretend she'd seen nothing, to walk away and preserve the careful invisibility she'd built her entire life around. She should have taken it. Instead, she closed the door behind her and heard the lock click into place. The sound of the lock echoed in the narrow corridor like a verdict. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned back to face him. The Alpha King hadn't moved, but his eyes had darkened, that predatory focus sharpening into something that made her wolf press low and still inside her chest. "That was foolish," Paul said quietly. "Probably." Sarah crossed the space between them, each step feeling like a choice she couldn't take back. "Let me see the wound." "I've survived worse, and bled out alone in forgotten corridors." She stopped just out of reach, close enough to smell the copper tang of blood mixed with something else, pine and winter air, the scent that clung to him after he'd been running. "Let me see it." For a long moment, he simply watched her. Then, slowly, he removed his hand from his side. The gash ran deep across his ribs, the edges ragged as if something had torn rather than cut. Blood welled thick and dark, soaking into the ruined leather of his undershirt. Sarah's breath caught. This wasn't a training accident. This was an ambush. "Who did this?" she asked, already moving closer. "Assassins." "3 of them." His voice remained steady despite the blood loss. "I dealt with them." Clearly. Sarah pulled a clean cloth from her archival supplies, meant for handling delicate documents, now pressed against a king's wound. "This needs stitching." "In the morning, the royal physician will ask questions you don't want to answer." She applied pressure, feeling him tense beneath her hands. Muscle and heat and barely restrained power. "That's why you came here instead of your chambers." Paul's jaw tightened. "You're perceptive." "I'm an archivist. I notice what doesn't fit the pattern." Sarah kept her eyes on the wound, not trusting herself to look at his face. Not this close. Not with her hands on his skin. 3 assassins shouldn't have gotten past your guard, which means someone let them in. "That," he said softly, "is a dangerous conclusion to voice aloud." "Then it's fortunate we're alone in an abandoned corridor where kings come to bleed in private." Something shifted in the air between them. Sarah felt it like static before a storm, that electric awareness that made her too conscious of every breath, every heartbeat. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, despite the blood loss. Close enough to see the faint scar along his collarbone, the one that disappeared beneath his collar. She'd memorized that scar in her fantasies. Paul inhaled slowly, and Sarah realized her mistake. Her scent, the shift in her breathing, the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer proximity to something she'd wanted for so long. "You're afraid," he observed, but it wasn't a question. It was a test. "Yes," she lied. "No." His hand came up slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away. His fingers touched her chin, tilting her face until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. "Fear has a scent. This isn't it." Sarah's pulse thundered in her throat. She should step back, should lower her eyes, should remember that alphas, especially kings, could sense desire the way wolves sensed weakness. But she'd already locked the door, already crossed every invisible line that kept omegas safe and invisible. "You're imagining something," Paul said quietly, his voice dropping to that register that made her knees weak. "Right now, in this moment." The words hit her like a physical touch. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "No," Sarah whispered, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. His thumb brushed her jawline. The touch feather-light but devastating in its restraint. "I can feel your pulse racing, see your pupils dilate, scent the shift in your—" He stopped himself, something flickering across his face. Not hunger, something darker. "Tell me to leave you alone, Sarah." It was the first time he'd ever spoken her name. She should have said yes, should have used the escape he was offering, should have remembered that her fantasies were meant to stay locked in her head, where they couldn't destroy her. Instead, she pressed the cloth more firmly against his wound and said, "You're still bleeding. We need to move you somewhere safer." For a heartbeat, neither of them breathed. Then Paul's hand dropped from her face. "There's a storage room, 3 corridors east. No one uses it." "I know the one." Of course she did. She knew every forgotten corner of these archives. Sarah wound the cloth tight around his ribs, makeshift but functional. When she finished, Paul pushed off the wall with controlled effort. He swayed once, barely perceptible, but she caught it. Without thinking, she moved to his side, ducking under his arm to brace him. The position pressed her against his uninjured side. Intimate, unavoidable. "I can walk," he said. "Then walk." But Sarah didn't move away. Neither did he. They moved through the shadowed corridors like conspirators, Sarah guiding them through passages she'd walked 1,000 times. Paul's weight against her felt surreal. This man who commanded armies, leaning on an Omega archivist no one noticed. She was complicit now, in his wound, in his secrets, in whatever game of shadows and blood was playing out in the castle above their heads. And when they finally reached the storage room, and she helped him settle against the wall, watching his silver eyes track her every movement with that unsettling focus, Sarah understood one terrible truth. Her fantasy had never been the dangerous part. Reality was so much worse. Paul refused to return to his royal chambers. "Too many eyes," he said, his voice tight with pain, as Sarah helped him settle onto the narrow cot in the storage room. "Too many questions." "Then where?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer, made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with concern. "My private study, the one in the East Tower." His silver eyes met hers in the dim light. "No guards, no servants, just me. And now, apparently, her." The walk through the castle's hidden passages felt endless. Sarah supported more of his weight than Paul would ever admit, feeling the tremors that ran through his frame, exhaustion and blood loss finally catching up to legendary control. By the time they reached the tower study, dawn light was bleeding gray through the narrow windows. The room was nothing like she'd imagined. No grand throne or display of power. Just worn leather chairs arranged before a massive stone hearth, shelves crammed with books and maps, a desk buried under reports. It looked lived in, human. "Sit," Sarah commanded, guiding him toward the chair closest to the fireplace. Paul actually obeyed, which told her exactly how badly he was hurting. She found clean cloth and water, medical supplies tucked in a cabinet that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd tended his own wounds in secret. The thought sent ice through her veins. How many times had the Alpha King bled alone, rather than show vulnerability? Sarah knelt beside his chair and began cleaning the wound properly. The gash looked worse in better light, deep and vicious, the kind that would scar. Her hands worked with steady precision, years of careful archival work, translating into surprisingly competent field medicine. "You're good at this," Paul observed, his voice low. "I'm good at being careful." Sarah didn't look up. Safer to focus on the wound than his face. "It's how invisible people survive." "You're not invisible." Her hands stilled. "To you, maybe. Right now. Because you need help." "No." Something in his tone made her look up. Paul was watching her with that unnerving focus, the one that felt like being seen down to the marrow. "You've never been invisible to me." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Sarah forced herself to return to her work, threading the needle she'd found in the medical kit. "The court would disagree. I've served in the archives for 3 years. You've never spoken to me before tonight." "I've spoken to you 17 times. Her hands froze. "What?" 17 times, Paul repeated quietly. "The first was 2 years ago. You were carrying a stack of genealogy records that blocked your view. I held a door open. You thanked me without looking up." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The most recent was 6 days ago. You passed me in the corridor outside the council chambers. You dropped your gaze and whispered, 'Your Majesty,' so softly I almost didn't hear it." Sarah stared at him, the needle forgotten in her hand. He'd counted. He'd remembered. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "I don't know." Paul's expression shifted, frustration flickering across features that rarely showed anything. "That's what unsettles me. I notice details. It's necessary for survival. But with you—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I notice everything. The way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're concentrating. How you mouth words while you read. That you take the night shifts because you prefer the silence." "You're describing surveillance," Sarah said, though her voice came out breathless. "I'm describing observation." His hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away, before his fingers caught a strand of her hair. "There's a difference." Sarah's heart hammered. She should move, should remember her place, should— "How do others look at you?" The question tumbled out unbidden. Paul's hand dropped. For a moment, something raw flickered across his face. With fear, with calculation, with the weight of what they want from me. He leaned his head back against the chair, exhaustion carving lines around his eyes. The court sees a crown, the packs see a weapon, the council sees a problem to be managed. "And what do you see when you look in the mirror?" The question seemed to surprise him. Paul was quiet for a long moment, firelight casting shadows across the brutal architecture of his face. Someone trying very hard not to become the monster everyone expects. The honesty of it struck her like a blow. Sarah had spent years imagining what lay beneath his control, but she'd never considered this, that his restraint wasn't just discipline, but desperate prevention. That he feared himself more than anyone feared him. "You're not a monster," she said softly. "You don't know that. I know you gave me 17 chances to see you as human." Sarah resumed stitching, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. A monster wouldn't bother counting. Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the whisper of thread through skin. Paul didn't flinch as she worked, but she felt the tension in him, Not from pain, but from proximity, from being seen in return. When she finished, Sarah tied off the final stitch and sat back. Done. You'll need to rest and... Stay. The word stopped her mid-breath. Just... Paul's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in that silver gaze. A little longer. Please. It wasn't a command. It was a request. And Sarah, who had spent her entire life being careful, being invisible, being safe, found herself settling onto the floor beside his chair without a word. Outside, the sun continued its slow rise over the Stonewolf dominion. Inside, something far more dangerous was awakening between an Omega who hid her fantasies and a king who noticed everything. Sarah stayed for 3 days. Not continuously. That would have sparked rumors even the castle's thick walls couldn't contain. But she returned each evening after her archive shift ended, slipping through the hidden passages with supplies and fresh bandages, pretending this was merely duty and not the slow unraveling of every defense she'd ever built. On the second night, Paul asked her to read to him. "The wound makes it difficult to focus," he said, though Sarah suspected the truth was simpler and more devastating. He was lonely. She chose carefully from his collection, avoiding romantic epics and settling on the founding of the Northern Pax, a dry political history that should have been safe. It wasn't. "And so the Omega Accords were signed," Sarah read aloud, firelight dancing across the ancient pages, establishing that unmated Omegas of breeding age would be held in trust by the Council, distributed to strengthen territorial alliances and ensure Pax stability. Distributed? Paul's voice cut through the crackling silence, sharp with disgust. As if they were grain stores. Resources to be allocated. Sarah's fingers tightened on the book. It was a different time. It was 3 generations ago. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. My grandfather signed those accords. The Council still quotes them when they push their political matches. You've refused everyone, Sarah said carefully. It was common knowledge in the castle. The Alpha King's stubborn resistance to taking a mate had become its own form of legend. Because I won't treat someone as currency. Paul's jaw tightened. The bond is supposed to be sacred, not a treaty sealed with a body. The bitterness in his voice caught her off guard. Sarah had assumed his refusal came from that legendary control, from not wanting the vulnerability a mate would require. She'd never considered it might be principle. The Council claims stability requires strategic bonds, she ventured. The Council claims many things. His eyes met hers, including that Omegas are happier when their choices are made for them. Do you believe that? The question hung between them like a blade. No, Sarah admitted quietly. I believe we learn very young that wanting the wrong thing is dangerous, so we stop wanting at all. Something shifted in Paul's expression. Recognition, maybe, or grief. And if you could want, freely. The words trembled on her tongue. I'd want you. I'd want to be chosen, not assigned. I'd want to watch your control break because you trusted me enough to let it. Instead, she turned back to the book. Shall I continue? Paul let her retreat. He always did. Sarah read for another hour, her voice filling the quiet spaces of the tower study. The history was brutal, wars over territory, Pax destroyed, Omegas traded like spoils. But woven through it were smaller moments, a pair bond that stopped a decades-long feud, an Omega advisor whose strategy saved her pack from annihilation, rare glimpses of love cutting through political machinery. Stop, Paul said suddenly. Sarah looked up. What? Go back. That last section. She backtracked to a passage she'd barely registered. Alpha Marcus of the Riverlands defied the council by bonding his chosen mate without approval. When challenged, he stated simply, "I will not rule without her. If that makes me unfit, so be it." The council, facing either acceptance or civil war, yielded. "He chose her," Paul said softly. "Over his crown. Over everything. He almost lost his kingdom. But he didn't lose her." Paul's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "That's the part the council never mentions, that sometimes the thing they call weakness is actually the only honest strength we have." Sarah's breath caught. She understood suddenly that they weren't just talking about history anymore. The silence that followed felt different, charged with all the things neither of them could say. Sarah closed the book, her hands unsteady, and found Paul watching her with an expression that made her wolf stir restlessly. "Tell me something true," he said. "Something you've never told anyone." "That's not fair." "I know." But he didn't look away. Sarah considered lying, considered deflecting, considered all the safe responses an invisible Omega should give an Alpha King. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I imagine what it would be like to be dangerous instead of careful." "You are dangerous." Paul's voice dropped to barely above a murmur. "You just don't realize it yet." Before she could respond, his eyes drifted closed. The exhaustion he'd been fighting finally claimed him, his breathing evening into the rhythm of sleep. Sarah should have left then, should have gathered her things and retreated to safety. Instead, she stayed, watching the firelight play across his features, memorizing the rare peace that softened the brutal lines of his face. "Sarah," he murmured, still asleep. Just her name. Spoken like a secret, like a prayer. Her heart stopped. He didn't wake, didn't seem aware he'd spoken at all. But Sarah heard it. The want in that single word, the unconscious confession that mirrored the fantasies she'd buried for so long. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her pulse thunder beneath her palm. This wasn't one-sided anymore. Whatever this was, this awareness, this pull, this dangerous recognition, it lived in both of them now, growing, multiplying, becoming something that couldn't be safely contained. Sarah finally understood why the council feared unbonded kings, not because desire made them weak, but because love made them willing to burn the world down. And she was falling. They both were, into something that could save them, or destroy everything they'd ever known. The wound healed faster than Sarah's carefully constructed distance. By the fourth day, Paul was moving through the castle again, slower than usual, favoring his left side, but present enough that the court stopped whispering about mysterious absences. Sarah returned to her archive duties, to her night shifts and her invisibility. She told herself it was better this way. She almost believed it. Then the council called an emergency session, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She wasn't supposed to be there. The council chambers were forbidden to anyone below senior staff rank. But the archives shared a wall with the deliberation room, and the ventilation shafts carried sound with perfect, damning clarity. Sarah was cataloguing inheritance disputes when the voices filtered through. 12 years, Your Majesty." Councillor Perth's reedy voice was unmistakable. 12 years without a mate bond. The packs are restless. They question your stability. My stability has kept this kingdom intact. Paul's response came cold and measured. Perhaps the council should concern itself with the assassination attempt, rather than my personal affairs. The two are connected. This voice belonged to Lady Vex, the Council's Omega representative, though Sarah had always found it darkly ironic that an Omega who'd been traded like cattle now helped perpetuate the system. An unbonded king is vulnerable, politically and physically. I survived 3 assassins. This time, Perth again. But what of the next attempt? What happens to the Dominion if you fall without an heir? Sarah's hands stilled on the document she'd been transcribing. She knew she should move away, should give them privacy, but her feet had forgotten how to move. We've prepared a list, Lady Vex continued. Suitable Omegas from the major packs, strong bloodlines, politically advantageous matches. The sound of parchment sliding across wood. Omega Celeste from the Silverpine pack. Her father controls the Eastern Territories. Omega Margaret from the Ironwood line. Their alliance would secure the northern borders. Omega. No. The single word cut through the recitation like a blade. Your Majesty, Perth said carefully, you cannot continue refusing. I can refuse as long as these suitable Omegas are presented like livestock at auction. Paul's voice had dropped to that dangerous register Sarah recognized. Find me a list of intelligent, capable individuals who have agency over their own lives, and I'll consider it. Bring me another roster of political pawns, and I'll have you removed from this council. Silence crashed through the chamber. You're being unreasonable, Lady Vex said finally. The bond isn't about personal preference. It's about duty. Then perhaps, Paul replied, duty and I need to renegotiate our terms. Sarah heard him leave, footsteps sharp and angry, the council chamber doors slamming with enough force to rattle the ventilation grate. She should have felt relief, pride even, at his refusal to treat Omegas as commodities. Instead, ice settled in her stomach, because Perth's voice drifted through again, quieter now but sharp with calculation. He's protecting someone. Impossible, Lady Vex scoffed. We monitor all his interactions. There's been no one. Then explain his sudden interest in the welfare of unbonded Omegas. Explain why he's been spending evenings in the East Tower study when he's always preferred his royal chambers. The assassination attempt was 3 days ago. His wound is healed, yet he continues to avoid his usual quarters. A pause, heavy with implication. Someone has access to that study. Someone he trusts. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. You think he's already chosen? Lady Vex sounded intrigued rather than concerned. Without council approval? I think, Perth said slowly, that we need to identify every Omega who's had private access to the Alpha King in the past week. And we need to do it quietly. Sarah backed away from the ventilation shaft, her hands shaking. She'd been so careful. The hidden passages, the late hours, the absolute discretion. But careful wasn't the same as invisible. Not when the council was looking. She didn't go to the East Tower that evening, or the next. On the 3rd night, Paul found her in the lower archives. You've been avoiding me, he said without preamble, appearing in the doorway like a shadow given form. Sarah kept her eyes on the manuscript she wasn't actually reading. I've been working. Sarah. Just her name. Spoken the way he had in his sleep, like it meant something. She forced herself to look up. Paul stood in the entrance, blocking the only exit, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. But his body language betrayed him. Tension in his shoulders, something almost like hurt in the set of his jaw. The council is investigating you, Sarah said quietly. They think you're protecting someone. They're going to start monitoring anyone who's had private access to you. Let them. Paul. His name escaped before she could stop it, intimate and dangerous. If they find out that we've been... What? He moved closer, each step deliberate. That you've been helping me recover. That I've found someone whose company I actually value. What exactly are we hiding? Everything, Sarah thought. The way I look at you. The way you say my name. The fact that my fantasies are becoming memories, and I don't know how to stop wanting more. Your reputation, she said instead. Your authority. The council will use me against you. Then they'll learn, Paul said, stopping just close enough that she could feel his presence like heat, that some things aren't negotiable. The words settled between them, heavy with promise and threat. Sarah's wolf stirred, not with fear, but with desperate, dangerous hope, because she finally understood what terrified her most. Not that the council would discover them, but that Paul was willing to defy them. That her fantasy, being chosen over duty, over politics, over everything, was becoming real. And in the Stone Wolf dominion, where power was law and omegas were leverage, that kind of choice could destroy them both. Sarah made it 4 more days before Paul stopped asking permission. She was deep in the restricted archives, the oldest section, where dust coated everything and the air smelled of forgotten centuries, when she felt him enter. Not heard, felt. The way prey sensed a predator, the way the moon felt the pull of the earth. Her hands stilled on the ancient genealogy she'd been cataloging. You can't keep running from me in a building I own, Paul said from somewhere behind her. Sarah didn't turn around. I'm working. You're hiding. Maybe they're the same thing. She heard him move closer, footsteps deliberate on the stone floor. The archive stacks were narrow here, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Sarah was effectively cornered between shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their contents pressing in on all sides. The council questioned 3 omegas today, Paul said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. Kitchen staff who'd brought meals to the East Tower. They're hunting, Sarah. Then stay away from me. She gripped the shelf in front of her, knuckles white. Make it easy for them to dismiss me as irrelevant. Is that what you want? It's what's safe. That's not what I asked. The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea, wrapped into one. Sarah finally turned. Paul stood less than 2 feet away, close enough that the lamplight caught the silver in his eyes and turned them molten. He'd positioned himself carefully, blocking her exit, but not crowding her, giving her space even as he demanded answers. What do you want from me? Sarah whispered. The truth. Paul moved closer, one hand bracing against the shelf beside her head. Not touching. Never touching without permission. But close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the pine and winter that clung to him. Stop pretending you don't feel this. Feel what? Whatever it is that makes your pulse race when I'm near. That makes you catch your breath when I say your name. That makes you look at me like... He stopped, jaw tightening. Like what? Sarah's heart hammered. Like I'm not just a king. Like you see something worth wanting. The confession cracked through her defenses, like lightning through stone. Sarah stared at him, at this man who ruled through absolute control, who held himself back from everything, now admitting he'd noticed every small betrayal her body had made. You think this is one-sided, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. You think I'm the only one who... I know exactly what you imagine. Paul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I can sense it, the shift in your scent when you look at me. The way your breathing changes. I notice everything about you, Sarah. Everything you try to hide. Heat flooded through her. Embarrassment and desire twisted together until she couldn't separate them. Then you know why I have to stay away, Sarah said desperately. You know what they'd do if they discovered. That you want me? Paul's free hand rose slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, before his fingers caught her chin, tilting her face up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. That I want you back. That I've spent 12 years refusing political matches because the idea of touching someone I don't choose makes my wolf recoil. Sarah's breath caught. Paul. Say no, he said urgently, his thumb brushing her jawline with devastating gentleness. Tell me to step back. Tell me this is just duty and proximity and loneliness. Tell me anything that will make me stop wanting you. I can't. Then tell me what you want. Please, Sarah, because I'm holding on by a thread, and I need to know if I'm alone in this. The words broke something inside her. The careful control, the years of hiding, the terror of wanting the wrong thing. Sarah's wolf surged forward, desperate and demanding, urging her to finally speak the truth she'd buried for so long. I want. Her voice cracked. She forced herself to continue. I've imagined this. You. Like this. Close enough to feel dangerous. Paul's eyes darkened, but he didn't move closer. And in my fantasies, you lose control. The confession tumbled out, raw and honest and terrifying. Not because I submit, not because you command, but because you choose to. Because you trust me enough to stop holding back. For a heartbeat, Paul didn't react. Then something shifted in his expression. Not hunger, but fear. Raw and visceral. You don't understand what you're asking, he said hoarsely. I understand perfectly. No. His hand dropped from her face. You imagine control breaking. I imagine becoming the kind of alpha who mistakes desire for entitlement, who takes instead of asking. Who? He stopped, breathing ragged. Sarah reached up slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over his heart. Felt it hammering beneath her palm. I'm not asking you to take, she whispered. I'm asking you to choose. There's a difference. Paul made a sound, half laugh, half broken exhale. You're going to destroy me. Or save you. We won't know unless... The bond hit like lightning. Not complete. They weren't touching skin to skin, weren't aligned in all the ways that would snap it into place. But Sarah felt it reaching, a golden thread spinning between them, pulling taut with recognition and want and years of denied possibility. Paul jerked back as if burned. No. The loss felt like being hollowed out. Not like this, he said roughly, putting distance between them with visible effort. Not in secret, not while the council is hunting, not until you understand that choosing me means choosing danger. Sarah's wolf howled in protest, but the human part of her, the part that had learned to be careful, to survive, understood. Then what? She asked. Paul looked at her and Sarah saw everything in that gaze. Want and fear and desperate restraint. Then we stop pretending this isn't happening, he said. And we face what comes next together. The poisoning happened at dawn. Sarah was in the lower archives, cataloging territorial disputes from the previous century, when the alarm bells shattered the morning silence. Not the standard pattern for drills or minor threats. This was the rapid, urgent clanging reserved for attacks on the royal family. Her wolf surged forward, instinct overriding caution. Paul. She abandoned her post and ran. The castle was chaos. Guards rushed through corridors, servants pressed against walls to let armed patrols pass, courtiers clustered in doorways exchanging frantic whispers. Sarah navigated the pandemonium with single-minded focus, taking servant passages toward the royal wing. A hand caught her arm. She spun, ready to fight, and found herself facing Commander Hayes, Paul's head of security, his scarred face grim. "You need to come with me," he said. Not a request. "What happened? Is the king alive?" "Barely." Hayes pulled her into an empty corridor. "Someone poisoned his morning tea. He collapsed during the council meeting." Ice flooded Sarah's veins. "Who?" "That's what we're trying to determine." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "The tea service came from the royal kitchens. Standard protocol. But the poison was wolfsbane extract, rare, expensive, and requiring specific knowledge to prepare." The implication hit her like a physical blow. Wolfsbane, the herb she'd used for years, the herb she'd researched extensively in the archives. "You think I—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "I think," Hayes said carefully, "that someone is trying very hard to make it look like you." The head archivist reported that restricted botanical texts were accessed from your station last week. Texts detailing wolfsbane preparation. "I was researching historical omega suppression methods." Sarah's mind raced. "For a genealogy project on the Omega Accords. It's all documented in my work logs." "I believe you." Hayes's expression softened fractionally. "But the council won't. Especially not when they discover the king has been meeting with you privately. They know. They suspect. This poisoning gives them justification to investigate everyone close to him." He glanced down the corridor. "The king is demanding to see you, against my strong advisement." "Then take me to him." Paul was in his private chambers, surrounded by healers and guards, looking murderous despite the pallor in his face. When Sarah entered, his silver eyes locked onto her with such intensity, she felt it like a physical touch. "Everyone out," he commanded. "Your Majesty, you need—" A healer began. "Out." The room cleared within seconds. Sarah stood frozen as the door closed, leaving them alone for the first time since the archives. Since the bond had nearly snapped between them. "You're alive," she said uselessly, "because I have a tolerance for wolfsbane that would kill most alphas." Paul's voice was rough, whether from the poison or something else. Years of building immunity to common assassination methods. Paranoid, perhaps, but effective. They think I did this. I know. He moved toward her, still unsteady but determined. "Which is why you're not leaving this wing." "Paul, I can't." "You can, and you will." He caught her shoulders, his grip firm. "Someone set you up." "Sarah, someone who knows about us. Who knows it would destroy me to watch you be accused." The words hung between them, an admission neither could take back. "The council will call it proof you're compromised," Sarah whispered. "That your judgment is clouded by—" "By what? Caring whether an innocent person is executed for a crime they didn't commit?" Paul's jaw tightened. "Let them." "You can't protect me against the entire council." Something dark flickered across his face. "Watch me." "Paul, I would burn this kingdom to ash before I let them touch you." The confession came out raw and honest and terrifying. "I hate that truth. I hate that they've made me choose between duty and—" He stopped, breathing hard. "And what?" Sarah's heart hammered. "And the only person who's ever made me want to be more than just a king." The weight of it crashed over her. This wasn't protection born from political calculation or abstract principle. This was personal, visceral, the kind of protective instinct that turned alphas dangerous. "You can't think like that," Sarah said desperately. The kingdom needs you stable, rational, not what? Not willing to destroy anyone who threatens you? Paul's laugh was bitter. Too late. A sharp knock interrupted them. Commander Hayes entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim. We have a problem. Lady Vex is calling for the Omega Archivist's immediate arrest. She's convinced half the council that the king is under undue influence. Then convince them otherwise, Paul said coldly. I can't. Not without revealing the extent of your association. Hayes looked between them. They're voting on it now. If she wins, they'll take custody within the hour. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. Custody, which meant interrogation, trial, execution, if they found her guilty. Paul's hand tightened on her shoulder. Then we move her to the inner chambers. Post guards I trust personally. No one enters without my direct authorization. That will be seen as confirmation of her guilt, and of your compromise. I don't care. Your Majesty. The window exploded inward. Glass shattered across stone as 3 figures in black dropped through, blades already drawn, professional, coordinated, and moving with the single-minded focus of trained killers. Not just assassins, an execution squad. Sarah registered the silvered edges of their weapons, designed specifically to kill Omegas quickly. This wasn't about Paul anymore. This was about eliminating her. Paul moved before she could scream, shoving her behind him as his wolf surged forward. His eyes flashed gold, canines lengthening as partial shift rippled through him. Touch her, he snarled, and I'll show you what an unbonded king is really capable of. The lead assassin smiled. That's what we're counting on, Your Majesty. Then they attacked. The first assassin moved like water, fluid, fast, deadly. Paul met him mid-strike, catching the silvered blade bare-handed. Blood welled between his fingers, but he didn't flinch. Just twisted, snapped the assassin's wrist, and sent him crashing into the stone wall with enough force to crack bone. The second assassin went for Sarah. She saw the blade arc toward her throat, saw her death reflected in polished silver, and her wolf screamed in defiance. But before she could move, Paul was there, moving faster than should have been possible, his body a shield between her and the weapon. The blade scored across his shoulder instead of her neck. Paul's roar shook the chamber. The shift rippled through him, not complete, but devastating. His bones cracked and reformed, muscle and sinew expanding, claws extending from fingers that were no longer quite human. His eyes blazed pure gold, all traces of silver consumed by his wolf's fury. Sarah had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her fantasies. Paul losing control. The civilized veneer stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. Reality was so much more terrifying, and so much more beautiful, because even as his wolf surged forward with lethal intent, even as he tore through the second assassin with brutal efficiency, he never stopped positioning himself between Sarah and danger. Every movement was calculated to protect her. Every strike designed to end threats before they could reach her. This wasn't mindless violence. This was precision wrapped in savagery. The third assassin, seeing his companions fall, made a desperate lunge for Sarah, apparently deciding if he couldn't kill the king, he'd complete his actual mission. Paul caught him midair by the throat. "She is mine," he snarled, voice distorted by the partial shift, "and you will never touch her." The words reverberated through Sarah's chest like a claiming, primal and absolute. The assassin gurgled something, blade still raised. Paul's claws tightened. One sharp jerk, and it was over. Silence crashed through the chamber. Paul stood among the bodies, breathing hard, blood, his and theirs, staining his clothes and skin. His wolf still rode close to the surface, visible in the gold of his eyes and the tension in his frame. Dangerous, barely contained. He turned to Sarah. For a heartbeat, she saw the fear flash across his face, that raw terror of what she might see when she looked at him now. Not a king, not even a man, just a wolf who'd killed to protect what was his. Sarah closed the distance between them. "Don't," Paul said hoarsely. I can't." She placed her hand over his heart, felt it hammering beneath her palm, frantic and powerful. "I trust you," Sarah whispered. The words broke something in him. Paul made a sound, half sob, half growl, and pulled her against his chest, not roughly. Despite the blood and the violence and the wolf still riding his skin, his arms came around her with devastating gentleness. "You shouldn't," he said into her hair. "You saw what I saw you protect me." Sarah pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I saw you stay in control even when you were letting go. I saw exactly what I've always imagined, Paul. Not dominance, not brutality, but restraint in the shape of violence. Power with purpose. That's not—" His voice cracked. "That's not what I saw in the mirror. Then look at me instead." Paul's eyes searched her face, looking for revulsion or fear or rejection. Finding none, something in him shattered. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing ragged, his whole body trembling with the effort of pulling his wolf back from the edge. "This is what they feared," he said. "An unbonded king losing control for someone. You didn't lose control. You chose violence to protect me. There's a difference. The council won't see it that way. I don't care what the council sees." The declaration hung between them, Sarah's own line in the sand. She'd spent her whole life being careful, being invisible, being safe. But Paul had shown her something more valuable than safety. He'd shown her what it meant to be chosen. The door burst open. Commander Hayes entered with a full guard detail, weapons drawn, only to freeze at the carnage. "Your Majesty." "The Omega stays," Paul said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite his disheveled state. "In my chambers. Under my personal protection. Anyone who questions this answers to me directly. The council will demand—" "The council," Paul interrupted, straightening to his full height, "will accept that their execution squad just tried to murder an innocent woman in my private chambers. They will accept that I eliminated the threat. And they will accept that questioning my judgment on this matter is questioning my fitness to rule." Hayes stared at him. "You're forcing them to choose." "I'm forcing them to recognize that some choices have already been made." Paul's hand found Sarah's, his fingers threading through hers. Blood-stained and steady. "Spread the word. The Omega Archivist is under the King's direct protection. She stays by my side until the traitors in the council are identified and dealt with." "Your Majesty, that's essentially a public claiming." "No." Paul's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. "It's a public choice. There's a difference." Sarah felt the bond stir between them, not snapping into place but strengthening, becoming something solid and real and impossible to deny. Hayes looked between them, understanding dawning in his scarred face. "The council won't accept this quietly. Then they'll learn to accept it loudly." Paul's jaw set with that stubborn determination Sarah had come to recognize. "I've spent 12 years refusing to treat people as political currency. I'm not starting now. Not even for the crown. Especially not for the crown," Sarah realized. Because somewhere between blood in the archives and violence in his chambers, Paul had stopped choosing between duty and desire. He'd simply chosen her. And in the Stonewolf Dominion, where power was law and kings were expected to sacrifice everything for stability, that choice was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. It was also, Sarah thought as she squeezed his hand back, the most human. "What now?" she asked quietly. Paul looked at her, gold still flickering in his eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression he showed the court, but something genuine and slightly wild and absolutely devastating. "Now," he said, "we see if the kingdom can survive an Alpha King who finally stopped being afraid of what he might become." The council convened at sunset. Sarah stood in the gallery above the deliberation chamber, no longer hidden in ventilation shafts, but visible, positioned where everyone could see her. Paul had insisted, if they were going to tear her apart, she would face them directly. Commander Hayes had uncovered the conspiracy within hours. The poisoning, the assassination attempts, the manufactured evidence, all orchestrated by a faction within the council who believed an unbonded king was too dangerous to let live. Lady Vex had been the architect, but she hadn't worked alone. 3 council members were already in custody. 2 more had fled, but the remaining council still held power, and they were furious. "You've overstepped, Your Majesty," Councillor Perth said, his voice tight with barely concealed rage. "Harboring a suspect, killing trained guards." "Trained assassins," Paul corrected coldly, "who broke into my private chambers to execute an innocent woman. After members of this council poisoned me and framed her for it." "We had no knowledge." "Then you're either complicit or incompetent. Choose which you'd prefer to be remembered for." Sarah watched Paul command the room from his position at the head of the chamber. He'd cleaned the blood away, dressed in formal regalia that transformed him back into the Alpha King. But she could still see the wildness lurking beneath. The wolf that had killed to protect her, now barely restrained behind royal authority. "The Omega was investigated and cleared," Perth said. "We accept your judgment on her innocence, but her continued presence in your private wing is inappropriate. It suggests nothing. It states clearly." Paul's voice cut through the murmuring like a blade. "Sarah stays by my side, not as property, not as political leverage, but because I have chosen to keep someone I trust close during a period when half this council tried to murder me." "Your Majesty, we understand the assassination attempt has shaken you." "I'm not shaken, I'm finished." Paul's eyes swept the chamber, cold and merciless. "Finished with treating people like chess pieces. Finished with the fiction that my personal life is subject to council approval. Finished pretending that your obsession with controlling my bond status is anything other than a power play." The silence that followed was absolute. "You're the Alpha King," Perth said carefully. "Your bond affects the entire Dominion's stability." "Then perhaps," Paul replied, "the Dominion needs to learn that stability doesn't require sacrifice, that strength and choice aren't mutually exclusive." He paused, letting the words settle. "I will rule this kingdom with or without your approval, but I will not rule alone. Not anymore." "You're claiming her," Lady Marrow, one of the remaining loyal councillors, said quietly. "Without council approval, without political consideration." "No." Paul's gaze found Sarah's across the chamber. "I'm announcing that someone I respect has agreed to stand beside me. What we choose beyond that is ours alone." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Not a bond, not yet, but a public acknowledgement that shattered every precedent the council had built. "This is unprecedented," Perth sputtered. "Good," Paul said. "Perhaps it's time for new precedents." Sarah found Paul on the tower balcony after the council finally, reluctantly, disbanded. The moon hung heavy over the Stonewolf Dominion, casting silver light across a kingdom still reeling from the day's revelations. "You just declared war on centuries of tradition," Sarah said, stepping beside him. "I declared independence from it. There's a difference." Paul glanced at her, something almost vulnerable in his expression. "Are you angry I didn't ask first? Are you angry I would have said yes?" His lips curved into that rare, genuine smile. "Terrified, actually. Of me? Of how much I'm willing to burn down for you?" He turned to face her fully. "The council will never stop pushing. They'll find new ways to test boundaries, new political matches to suggest, new reasons why this," he gestured between them, "is dangerous." "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Dangerous?" "Probably." Paul's hand rose slowly, cupping her face with the same devastating gentleness he'd shown after the violence. "But I've spent 12 years being safe, being the king they wanted, following rules designed to keep me isolated and controllable." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "I'm done with that. What if choosing me costs you the crown? Then I'll learn to live without it." The words came without hesitation. "But I won't learn to live without this. Without you looking at me like I'm more than just a title. Without someone who sees the restraint as strength instead of weakness." Sarah's throat tightened. "You know what's ironic? I spent years fantasizing about you losing control, about watching that perfect discipline finally break. I know. I could sense it. But it was never really about that." She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. "It was about trust, about someone powerful enough to destroy me, choosing not to. About control being a gift instead of a prison." "You taught me that," Paul said quietly. "You taught me the difference between restraint and fear, between strength and isolation." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You taught me how to be human again." The bond hummed between them, still not complete, still waiting for their final choice, but strong enough that Sarah could feel his emotions bleeding through. Fear and hope and desperate, terrifying love. "The council will call this weakness," she whispered. "Let them." Paul's arms came around her, solid and sure. "I've learned that some things are worth being weak for. That's not weakness. No." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "It's the strongest thing I've ever done." Below them, the Stonewolf Dominion stretched into shadow and moonlight. A kingdom built on power and hierarchy, and the careful distribution of control. A kingdom that would have to learn, slowly and painfully, that their alpha king had found something more valuable than absolute authority. He'd found choice. Sarah leaned into Paul's warmth, feeling the future unfold before them. Complicated and dangerous, and absolutely worth fighting for. Her fantasy hadn't made her weak. It had shown a king what strength really meant. And the moon didn't force him to choose her. He chose, anyway. The end. If you loved Sarah and Paul's story, drop a comment below. Your voice determines what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe for more moonlit tales of power, restraint, and the dangerous beauty of being truly chosen.